My name is Sandra Phillips, and I'm the founder and CEO of MoveMe, a small boutique agency focused on shared mobility architecture. In other words, we design, plan, and build new shared mobility services such as car share, micromobility, and integrating them with public transit. We've done about 60 projects so far, and I'm really excited that for the February edition of Multimodal Mondays, we're talking incentives and behavior change with Andy from Commutifi, Jessica from Stanford University, and then Mikki Taylor-Hendrix from Detroit, DDOT. So before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty questions, I'll let you guys kind of tell the listeners or viewers of this edition kind of why you're working in behavior change and incentives and what you're doing around that. And I'm just going to start. Let's just mix it up. I'll start with Jessica this time.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks so much for having us here today. It's a fascinating topic and something that I think is near and dear to all of our hearts. My name is Jessica Alba. I joined Stanford University as an internal and external liaison on transportation policy matters in 2017. And prior to Stanford, I was a planner and principal at Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates and Trivector Traffic. Trivector is in Sweden, so that was many, many years ago before I moved here in 2004. But both of these firms are thought leaders on transportation solutions that put people first. And in this career, my now 20-year career, I've really mixed my background, my academic background in earth science and environmental policy with everything that has to do with the transportation space. And I have to say that I'm cautiously optimistic about the future, especially with the Biden administration's focus on transportation investments that will create jobs, promote racial and economic equity, and prioritize both climate resilience and broad environmental sustainability goals. And it might be a tagline for the administration, but it's a really good one that I fully support and believe in. And I do think that transportation behavior and incentives and nudging are really important tools in continuing to make our transportation systems as seamless as possible.
Yes, and we'll talk about this nudging and behavior change and how that actually works in the real world in a minute. But I think there's an interesting, link between what policy does and on the political side what happens, and then what needs to happen on the ground. And so I'm going to kick it over to Andy because he works with a technology firm that really works on the ground trying to change behavior. So maybe tell a bit about what you do and why are you so fascinated with the behavior economic side of things of transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll echo what Jessica said. Thanks for having us on, and this is a really interesting topic. And my name's Andy Keeton. I'm with Commutifi, which is a TDM data automation and commute management platform. So we're working with, commute administrators at various levels to help them try to kind of come up with the best data-driven projects that can really move people out of single occupancy vehicles into something more sustainable. Prior to working here with Commutifi, I was with Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank kind of operating in the energy and mobility transformation space. And I had the really interesting opportunity to work with the behavioral economics kind of division within the mobility space to think about how we can influence behavior change kind of in a long-term, sustainable, both, two-way sustainable, sustaining that change long-term and sustainable in that lower emissions and environmental impact, and get people really out of single occupancy vehicles. And that through that work, that's where I actually met Commutifi and have since kind of brought that idea into the Commutifi platform. And it's really exciting because we get to look at a whole set of kind of data points, how people are actually commuting on a daily basis, whether it's within a company or within a city, and really get to see how kind of the data can point to certain programs that might shift that behavior, but without the right kind of behavioral nudges and the right triggers in place, it doesn't really matter that much. So, just because the data points to something, transportation is inherently, I'd say, not as rational as some other choices from like the economic theory of rationality. So you really need that behavior change aspect built into it. So that's something we're working hard to try to work with our partners on doing right now.
Yeah. And I think I first picked up on Commutifi because of that RMI paper that you worked on. So I will definitely come back to that in a minute and get a bit more insight. But before I do that, I'll ask Mikki from Detroit Dot to help us understand what you do and why behavior change is so important in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I'm Mikki Taylor-Hendrix. I'm really excited to be here and participate in this conversation today. I work for the Department of Transportation in Detroit, and unlike most Department of Transportation, we are actually a transit system. So I work specifically for the transit system here in Detroit, Michigan, and my work as an urban planner for the transit system is twofold. I work with the planning team on the network itself and improving the routing for the city, as well as leading most of our community engagement. So I'm really interested in this because that is most of what I do to just understand who our riders are and make sure that we as the transit system are providing them with the service and the resources that they need to get to where they have to go. So as new mobility options have come into Detroit in the last few years or so, it's been really interesting to see what people gravitate toward. So things like e-scooters have been pretty successful, and then what options people aren't really gravitating toward, and then exploring which ones work best with the transit system to, again, just kind of help people get to their destinations better. So looking at things like pilots around first mile and last mile options, as well as just kind of recognizing as the city continues to change and people's needs and work styles and travel trends continue to change, how do we make sure we are tapping into the right resources, we are exploring kind of the innovative things that are coming about to really make sure the system is as robust and successful as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to pick up on what you just said. Obviously, part of what your work is around figuring out how do people adopt kind of a multimodal lifestyle, right? Transit plus something else, whether it's scooters or bike share. And so what do you hear from community, what works and what hasn't? Obviously, you mentioned before that you had an incentive program for bike share and seemed to not work quite the way maybe it was anticipated. So what do you hear from the community itself? What works for them and what doesn't?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. We had a collaboration with our local bike share here in Detroit called MOGO, where if you bought a DDOT pass at any of our main offices, you automatically got a free monthly MOGO pass. So you were able to use the bike share for free for a month, whether you were buying a monthly DDOT pass or a weekly DDOT pass. And there were, I believe, over 2,000 passes given out, and the actual usage of the passes and simply activating the pass was very, very low. However, those who did activate the pass used it 25 days out of the 30 days. So they were really using the bike share, which to me says that they liked it and it worked. Whether it was for leisure or whether it was to get somewhere, it was well utilized. So we are actually now in the process, the early phases of a grant to kind of explore what happened, right? So why when something was so, accessible to you, why when it was free, did you still choose not to use it? So some of the things that we've heard kind of in general in Detroit, as a lot of things are changing here, and there's a lot of, opportunity. There's a lot of revitalization in the city. Some of the things we hear are just, this product isn't for me. Routine is hard to break. It's really hard to throw something out there and say, hey, try this, especially around something like commuting, right? So if you're taking transit to get to work, and this is already something you've been doing for however long, it's first thing in the morning, or, I already have my routine set. Do I really want to take that risk of trying something new? How will that impact my trip? Would it make me late? Do I really, is it really that beneficial for me? So there's a lot of just thoughts around breaking habit for people. And then also kind of realizing this is something for you. You know, we are trying to make your trips better. But then also, I think one of the big ones here is how it was introduced. So is this something that we actually brought to people and said, hey, you know, we want you to try this? And if people had questions, were they able to get those questions answered? Is it user friendly? So is it something really easy to adapt kind of out of the gate? Or is it something that we needed to spend a little more time on to really explain and get people comfortable with even trying?
Yeah. That's actually interesting you mentioned that because a while ago when I worked at Car2Go, that was one of the things, right? It's you can make it as easy as seamless and easy and convenient as possible, but if a person doesn't try it, um, you need somehow to get them into, we always say to get them into the car to try it one time, and then they're like, oh, now I understand why it's so easy. But you have to get that. So it's one thing making the pass affordable and accessible and easy, but then how do you translate that to get somebody on a bike? I can totally see that. That needs real human educational effort, essentially, right? Which is something, Andy, you mentioned before, is like how it goes back to this habit breaking and habit shift, and it's transportation is so sticky and irrational, quite frankly, not economically driven at all, even though people always say that, but that's not true. So how do we do that, and how can technology help? Like, especially also with this multimodal, right? Transit, they got the transit pass, so probably they used the transit pass, but never used the bike pass. So how do you do that with technology?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I was having this thought too while Mikki was talking. Um, one of the things that a lot of people often talk about is that something has to be 3 times better for someone to want to try it in the first place. But that might not actually even be enough of a multiplier. It might actually be closer to like 9 times better because, especially in transportation, where, like you said, it's inherently irrational, economically at least. People overweight their own choice maybe by 3 times, and they underweight another choice by 3 times. So when you have to be 3 times better, but each time is being, overweighted, underweighted, it ends up being like something like 9 times better that you have to like prove to them before someone just on their own will just decide, I'm going to go take this other mode, which is obviously irrational because if it's only slightly better, it's still better. So why don't you just choose the better option? So, that's just, I think, something super specifically related to transportation because, especially something like a commute, it's not really a choice in that, if I'm buying a t-shirt or something, I could say, yeah, I'll buy a sustainably made t-shirt. It costs this much more, but I feel this much better. And I make that choice every time I buy a shirt. But I probably have a specific habit with my commute, and I've never really thought differently about it, maybe for decades. In fact, like if you take the train into the office, you may even like stand on the same spot on the platform. You may even like try to sit in the same seat in the train every single day. And people just like habits, and especially on a commute. So how do we actually get someone to try something else, and then hopefully they really love it and they keep trying it? Like it sounds like in Detroit, people who got on the bike share system, they kept using the bike share system. So how do you get that? And that's something that, when I was with RMI and Commutifi came through the project to work with them, I was intrigued by because what Commutifi has done is built a score around each type of mode and each type of commute. So it's really giving you a baseline of understanding where you are, and it's giving you reference points to know where you could kind of go. It's hard to say I mean, maybe someone in the transportation space could easily, understand what is a better choice, but is a 20-minute bike ride that's free better than a 5-minute drive that I pay $5 to park somewhere? I don't know which one's better. So being able to kind of score things on an objective basis, this commute is a 30 and this commute's a 50, and I want to improve my score, then I could know better, okay, maybe I should try this 50. I don't have to think to myself, is $3 better than $6, but worse because it's more time. It's just give you that score. Hopefully then that kind of nudges you into thinking, oh, maybe I'll try this. And then we rely on the systems that we've all been working to build to say, keep coming, this is really good. There's also a lot of work to do with incentives and things like that, but I'm sure we'll keep talking about that as we go. I'll let other people kind of share their opinion first.
Yeah. So that's actually very fascinating because what you just described is essentially you're trying to take away my mental exercise and my wasting of my mental energy on deciding whether or not it's better or worse. You're basically doing that for me in a simple way to show me, okay, this is whatever, it's a 50 or 5-star, but you make it very easy. I don't have to think, which I can understand why that's attractive. There's so many decisions that you have to make in a day. So Jessica, you obviously work you work on behavior change from a different angle, looking at it from a policy side. And I'm really curious, because you've been at this for decades now, how has this changed? Like, how have public agencies and cities changed their approach to policy and motive, specifically also around this, habit change and what they should be doing or not?
Yeah. Oh, there are so many components of this to answer this, right? So thinking back almost 20 years or 15 years and coming to the Bay Area from Sweden, in Sweden, you typically have a really good bike network. You have a good transit network. You don't need a car. As a new mom, you can easily navigate the city by stroller or with your stroller and all of that. It's there. So you don't need to be a bike advocate or a transit advocate or a pedestrian walking advocate. And so coming here to the Bay Area, one of the big differences that I realized at the time was that in Sweden and in many places in Europe, and especially in the Nordic countries, sustainability was so ingrained in everything that we did that that was the driving force. Here in the United States and many other places around the world, the economic driver was so strong that it had to be an economic reason to shift. So I could come in on many parking and mobility management and transportation demand management projects as a consultant at the time and talk to my client about their needs, right? And usually it came down to an economic reason. Like, we can't spend all of this money on building new parking because it's too expensive to build parking structures compared to building surface lots. And so we could show them that if you invest in a strong transit system and a good bike network and something like Commutifi or another platform that nudges people, you can create change. And I could go home and sleep well because I could do it from a sustainability perspective when it was actually driven by economy and finances here to a much larger degree. And over this time, I would say the things that are the hardest to change are, for instance, minimum parking requirements. We continue to build so much parking and forcing developers to build parking with new development. We also have a really hard time shifting our focus away from, we need to move as far and as fast as possible as drivers without thinking about how that's impacting the transit rider or the bus that has 40 or 50 people in it compared to the single driver who is driving, 40 minutes to get to work, or the people who are trying to cross the street, or the people who want to be on a bike. I think it's those are two of the hardest things to change, to move away from minimum parking requirements and level of service analysis for car traffic. And that's taken, I would say that many in my field, and Mikki, you probably recognize this as well, those are really, really hard to change. So now we're at a point where cities that 5 or 10 years ago wouldn't have changed either one are now getting to the point where they're ready. And these are progressive cities. These are highly, they know what they're doing. So policy-wise, they're ready, but implementation-wise, they're not. So that's two of the things that I want to mention. What's breaking this are pilot programs and demonstration projects and data. So having performance metrics in place that really show what we're trying to achieve beyond just moving cars, and understanding the health impacts, the safety impacts, the sustainability impacts, the quality of life impacts, the greening impacts of having a more focus on moving people rather than moving cars. We're getting there. And so many cities here in North America and across the globe are now embracing this with micromobility and sharing economy and good infrastructure. So I think it's a combination of the regulations and ordinances that need to be changed, but also the infrastructure that needs to be built, and that how much more efficient and effective we can be with our current resources. So that's how we get to a truly sustainable and more equitable transportation system, because not everyone can afford owning a car. That's like $8,000 or $10,000 a year, and not everyone can jump on a scooter that costs, just getting on it is, $1, and then, for every mile it's this much more, and if you do that trip 3 times in a day, it's a lot of money. So having the city or the public agency working closely with the private operators in finding equity packages is really critical too, and creating as seamless of a mobility trip as possible.
So it's like, Andy, I think you said you need to make it 9 times more efficient. It's almost like you need that foundational piece even to start with.
Yes.
Before we can, and then you need what Mikki's work is, the engagement and the outreach and advocating for these multimodal. And then you can add that layer of technology and incentivizing and nudging people, kind of like, I'm simplifying things. I understand that, but that's kind of, without the basics, you can't even, it makes no sense to start incentivizing at the top.
Right.
Which kind of leads me to our last conversation topic, and that's really open to anyone, which is this whole idea of nudging people's behavior towards multimodal. And it comes up a lot in conversations with our clients, and I'm slightly skeptical. Maybe that's like my European background. I'm a slightly skeptic about this, because I sometimes think it is, kind of what Tammy Boyce describes as a short-term, politically motivated initiative, which doesn't have a lot of good evidence, and it generally doesn't sustain the long term. So I'm just going to throw that out. Thoughts. You come back at me and convince me or not convince me that it is actually a good idea. Andy is smiling at me, and I'm thinking he's like, I have a lot to say about that. So.
Yeah, I can start. A couple of things that kind of come from there. I generally agree that if you just throw together a program because there's some political will behind it, it often might work in the short term, but then once that political will is gone, then it's irrelevant at that point. And people stop doing whatever they were doing because in America, as Jessica said, cars just are the way to go in almost every city except maybe a handful. So yes, that's certainly an issue. One thing that I think is also important to point out is that it doesn't have to be like politically pushed forward for some, like holistic great purpose. It can just be that we're trying to save money as a city or as a state or something like that. So, it's expensive to maintain car infrastructure. It's expensive to pay for the externalities of emissions, even though maybe that's a harder one to measure. But it's expensive to not have your workers live in the city where you are trying to fund their work, but not getting taxes from them living there. So there's ways to try to incentivize that I think, and everyone will come together in America with this economic-driven belief that we can save money, we can help the economy. So that could be a long-term way to look at it. From a pure kind of behavioral or behavior change perspective, I think the tough thing is that, commutes specifically within transportation are habits, like I said before. So what we're trying to push with a lot of our customers and partners is to shift everything from habit reinforcing mechanisms like monthly parking or quarterly parking or even monthly transit passes to daily choices at kind of the highest level, so that every day when I wake up and I look outside and I say the weather's nice and I could take this bike trip, or I could walk in, then I can make that choice. And tomorrow I can still feel comfortable driving because it's raining, or I have to take my kid to practice after school or pick him up or something. That's perfectly fine, because if we can shift people only one day a week out of their car, that's still an improvement in the right direction. And then hopefully, once again, getting back to this, as people start to realize that there's better options out there than driving, like most people don't actually love driving in 40 minutes to work, then maybe over time that daily choice that they're making once a week, then maybe twice a week, hopefully eventually they're making it the majority of the time. And then you can maybe at that point start pulling back some of the incentive programs and things, because people are just now built that habit. But until those habits are built, you kind of have to keep those incentives in place. I'll give you, if I'm a company, I'll give you an extra day off of a vacation time if you don't drive in X number of times. And so we're continuing to push that until people no longer care about the vacation time. They just do it because they like it better.
Yeah. And Andy, I think you're making so many really good points. And I think we need to think about the pandemic as well as a really big life-changing event. And we know that life-changing events such as moving or having a child or starting a new job, that's a really fantastic time to start a new habit. And being prompted before, if you create a habit in the first 2 weeks and you drive to work for those 2 weeks, and then you're introduced to a package of transit or bike and all of that, it might be too late. You're already starting to create your habit. So having packages that are available up front that might work for you, depending on where you live and where you work and what you do, and especially now during when we know that most people will not return to the office 5 days a week. Most people will probably work from home 2 or 3 days a week if they can. If they're at home today, they will probably continue doing so in the future. Salesforce is the last one that announced just yesterday that they're going pretty much into the hybrid model as well, where if you really don't need to be in the office, don't come in. We're going to change our office layout so that it's more focused on the collaborative meeting kind of environment and less of you having to be in the office every day. So we're going to see huge changes. This impacts the opportunity to get people to take transit for commute purposes. We need to make transit more of an all-day service instead of just focusing on the commutes. And so that's a great opportunity for us to be prepared now in the coming months, as hopefully by early fall, who knows, the magic date keeps moving, right? More people will start returning when they have the shots, and people are starting to return on transit and bike share or ride sharing as well. But I do like the option of choosing your daily activity depending on what you need. If you only need to be in the office between 10 and 2, how do I get there? Is it sunny? Is it rainy? What other what other trips do I need to make today? So yes, all of this, but moving to a daily model, but thinking of transit as being capped at a certain amount per month so that you're not forced into spending a tremendous amount of money just because you're forced to take transit every day. Might also be something like the subscription model that you can pay per day, but there has to be a cap on how much you're spending for your mobility needs.
Yeah, which I was like,
I think
Jessica is giving you the perfect bridge, Mikki.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see when we talk about the data and how so much of what is expected to happen next is data driven. It's really interesting to see that historically successful transit was a system that had an increase in ridership. And that was the measure of success. So now that we're dealing with COVID and we're seeing so many people who were choice riders, or who just were commuting into an office not doing that, I think now is a perfect opportunity to kind of get away from that and say, how do we just make it great for the people using it? And then if it's great for the essential riders who are still having to take transit into work, they work at grocery stores, they work at our banks, how do we make it great for them? And explore things like flex passes, or how do we really simplify it, make it so, if it's running every 10 minutes at 8 a.m., it's also running every 10 minutes at 2 p.m., right? Because we have different shifts and people have different schedules, then it'll work well for those who are your choice riders. And it could be more attractive to people who are coming into the office or to get out of their car a couple of times a week, and to employers to say, hey, let's talk about building these packages that make it so you're saving money. It's more affordable for you to not pay for parking. It's more affordable for you to get away from that parking garage, and really make those options available. But starting at kind of the beginning and saying, let's really focus on the people already using our service. And I think now we really have the opportunity to do that, because we're telling people, if you don't have to use transit, don't use it. So I think now is a really good opportunity to kind of shift the focus and really focus on just improving the quality of the experience for riders.
That is so interesting. And
then I do think, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please go ahead.
I was gonna respond, so to the question specifically about, how political forces oftentimes drive what you're exploring and kind of the solutions. I agree with the statement that, sometimes political forces are definitely involved, right? And whether that's at a federal level, when we have grants that we're applying for and we have funding that we are supposed to, follow A, B, and C to secure, that's political. And so, like we talked about the Biden administration being transit friendly, everyone's excited, right? The opportunities are endless of what can happen with this administration. But I think a lot of times it does limit what we're exploring and actually providing solutions, because they are the blueprint is already laid out. You have to check this box, that box, and that box. But yeah, find the solution. Okay, so if we took out the boxes and we really focused on the problem, I think that's the best way to start. And so often we don't have that opportunity because there are stipulations attached to funding, or because they are guided by local, political direction, regional political direction. I know that plays a large part in Detroit. The region is so much bigger than the city. And so how do we make everybody happy? And how complicated can that really get, when we also know the average Detroiter needs to get to the suburbs for work or for grocery shopping or anything else. And there are so many different political layers in that one space. So
that is you guys have just pointed out a couple of things that I hadn't thought of. Andy, you kind of made, and you, Jessica, Mikki, you kind of reinforced it. We're already doing this nudging, we're giving people free parking at work. That is already a nudging mechanism that is economical.
And we're not charging enough for people who drive. I'm not saying that abolish driving. That's not what we're saying. We just need to show the external how much it really costs to get in the car, because we don't think about that when we use the car. So congestion fees is another way of nudging, right? It's a stick rather than a carrot, but they're really parking fees and demand-based parking fees, along with congestion fees that do depend on how congested the road is, or the cordon in whatever your area is. We need to use those mechanisms to also fund better sustainable transportation, such as walking, biking, and taking transit. There's no reason for 75% or 80 or 90% of our population to get in a car for every single trip. They're gonna be needed, but so many of these trips are 50% of our trips here in the United States, or at least in the metropolitan areas, are shorter than 3 miles. That's a 20-minute e-bike ride. You don't even get sweaty. So if we have the infrastructure, bike highways, and express bus system on a fast, efficient express bus system, on our freeways, we can shift so many of these trips and make people happier, more productive, and more satisfied with their lives in general.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think the other really interesting theme that keeps coming up is the fact that, and this probably again, European background, my background is Swiss, is a little bit like it was a shift for me as well to think, is this idea that it's economically driven? And the fact that part of this nudging and the challenge with political program is or the ticking the boxes is that it's money attached, and so at that point people really want to measure what the success is, but then it becomes really this short-term thinking.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know that we have, like, if somebody here has a really great answer of how to like get past that, I think
I do think the demonstration I do think the demonstration projects and pilot programs are the way to go, because it gives us an opportunity to try and measure certain things and then show that this is it makes perfect sense, or you show that it doesn't make sense, and you figure out why it doesn't make sense here when it works so well here. And so tailoring these demonstration projects and pilot programs and getting that up on the federal level as well, so that we have more flexibility and becoming more nimble as public agencies or even organizations in general. I think that's critical, especially in the coming years as we're, finding this new normal, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also,
I agree. I think looking at.
Oh, go ahead, Mikki.
Go ahead, Andy. No, you're good. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, looking at kind of the public-private partnership realm as well, that, for instance, we have a customer that's a big employer in the San Francisco Bay Area. They were looking at their, data of how people are commuting in, and they're like, 70% of people living within 2 miles are driving. And like, why are they doing this? And when you really look at it, it's because there's not good bike infrastructure. There's no public bike share in this city. So they're thinking, okay, how can we incentivize people to bike? Can we provide them with, pedal assisted e-bikes? But then it starts to be an equity issue, because this is a tech company that's providing high level, really good services to their particular employees, when I would assume they would prefer to not do as much work and just kind of fund a project that worked with the city. If the city were to come to them and say, hey, we want to put in a bike share system that's going to benefit you. We want to put in bike lanes that are going to benefit you, but we need some money. I bet you could find some people to do it. It's just someone has to take that initiative to go and do that, and no one really really wants to. But if you can find those public-private partnerships, they can work really well, because it does help the private companies who have all this money and are already helping themselves. They could just kind of spread the wealth a little to everyone.
Andy, you're making a great point, because parking valet or running a regional transit system as a private employer are incredibly operating. They're so expensive programs that most employers cannot do. If that could be, thought of as a 10-year budget, right? And think about it, if we invest this in capital infrastructure instead, how much would we be able to get? What kind of bike infrastructure could we pay for with that capital infrastructure or that funding? So I do think having using platforms such as Commutifi in order to show the savings that a company could make over 30 years or 15 years is interesting. Definitely interesting. Mikki, you were trying to say something before.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with public-private partnerships really, really being a key factor. I think they give you the opportunity to kind of explore real solutions, and they also have data, which is sometimes really hard to get. So I think if we're starting off with, hey, we have this particular employer, whether they're downtown or whether they're out in kind of the industrial space, they know where their employees live. They can find out how many people use transit. And then that, I think, is just a really good starting point to kind of delve into creating these solutions. Of course, keeping in mind being able to scale them out throughout the city. But I think, to Jessica's point, that's a huge opportunity to kind of pilot something. So instead of trying to do something citywide, if we start with one employer or one partner, we can kind of start here, see if it's sustainable financially, see if it's sustainable as far as keeping that product out, and really growing it is really important. I do think one of the concerns I come across with pilots is that it kind of gets people excited about something that initially isn't sustainable. So if you know this pilot is only here for a year, or you have a certain dollar amount that you have that particular pilot for, it can be really frustrating for the user if they, if I'm using this solution to get to work and it works great. So now I'm super comfortable working here, living here, commuting here, and then you take it away from me. Am I no longer comfortable with this commute? Does this job no longer work for me? Did I miss an opportunity to explore moving closer to work or working closer to home or investing in another mode of transit? So I think transparency is a huge factor when we look at piloting to make sure people kind of understand, hey, this is only around for this amount of time, and kind of remind them. So, hey, we've got another 3 months, or we have another X amount of dollars, which should last this amount of time, to just kind of make sure people kind of keep it in the back of their mind. You have it now. We really want your feedback. We really want to hear from you how it's working, but then it might be going away soon. So I think it can get a little complicated when it comes to the actual user experience.
And this goes back to what you guys were saying all at the beginning. It's a very tricky habit or sticky habit to shift in the first place. And so now you just make that shift, and now you're telling me now it's no longer there. So and then you automatically default to what you were used to before, because it's just easier to do that, right? Oh man, I think we could talk at least another half hour about this, or probably another day. But I do want to wrap up the Multimodal Monday. Is there any last thoughts around, incentives, mode shift, specifically multimodal mode shift, and what we kind of need to move this forward, come out of, this pandemic with a new, I don't like the new normal language, but kind of an improved normal.
Yeah. The one thing I want to add that we haven't discussed yet is the opportunity that a Transportation Management Association, a TMA or a TMO, can add to a region or a district that encompasses many organizations or partnerships. So it could be both residential and employer. It could be many employers working together in order to bulk purchase transit passes or do a really strong communications program or launch something. And these are really popular across the United States. And I'm hoping more districts and regions consider them as a model for more coordination across employers. And it's also an opportunity for an employer to pay into something that doesn't just benefit their employees, but rather the district or the region that they're participating in.
Great. Any last thought, Andy?
I just kind of echo what's been said and amplify it back up that we're already incentivizing driving and parking. So if you're thinking as talking more to like an employer or a property developer or someone in the private sector, if you're thinking about what could I do to incentivize transportation, but I don't have that much money, realize you're already spending a ton of money on parking, and you probably know that, or someone knows that in your organization. And so if you can remove one parking space that costs you $150, $200 a month, that's a lot of money that you can put into some other program. So think about it in terms of actually you can save money by shifting people to multimodal use. Instead of it's an added cost. It's actually potentially a savings, especially if you can start removing those parking spaces. And people are gonna be happier. So
yeah. So Mikki, last thought from you.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said. Coordination is a really huge factor. Accountability is also a big one. So as we talk about these employers, making sure they are participating in the communities that they exist in. And then transparency, I think keeping in mind the goals and who your product is for, and making sure that the user is a part of the overall development, and that they're just engaged throughout the entire process is really important as well.